I would make a case that ghost stories are about containable, controllable fear. You know, they're stories that we've told by the fireside for centuries now, and I think they are a bid to make sense of certain things. I think they're a bid to make sense of our fears, but certainly to make sense of our greatest fear, which is death. Not jittery, but just passionate. Throw my answer.
Shakespearean.
I guess it's that thing. I don't know. You know, it's that, when you like audio, I find I give myself my power through gesticulating, lots of gesticulating. So then when you move to telly, you kind of have to tone it down to kind of not look like you know, a sort of comedy.
That's a good place to start. I mean, how have you found going from doing the podcasts to then doing the TV presenting? Look, it's me like using my arms. As
Well, I mean, it was dauntingly brilliant. Basically, I mean, it was really fantastically exciting. The idea of taking something that works on audio and making it visual, and you know, there's a track record of that. Radio programs, particularly in comedy, have gone on and become things. And now, you know, you look around, you see many podcasts that have gone to become dramas, successful dramas. But it was daunting because a lot of people were basically saying, "Don't screw it up." You know,
nice.
We like it like this. You know, it works really well when you can't see the people. We're imagining what happened. How do you make it work visually? And so that was our challenge, and it, you know, it was exciting. I think kind of. I felt like I'd been given a new toolbox or a kind of a set of toys to play with, and you know, I'm somebody who loves horror movies, and I think, you know, what you can do visually with horror is incredible. I mean, certainly you can absolutely scare people through the audio medium by being in their ears and, you know, being very up close. Audio is a very intimate medium, and those moments that you have where you're kind of doing the washing up and you're listening to something and then someone taps you on the shoulder, we all know how much we jump in those moments. But you know, to have the ability to do jump scares and to bring things to life and to have really kind of frightening things on screen. I mean, I think, you know, a lot of people have told me they're very frightened by the podcast, but I know more people who've been really frightened by the television series, I think. And
really?
People with truly traumatized children, I think. Sat down to watch as a family and then couldn't. In fact, my own wife sent me a message saying, it's too scary for the kids who are watching Bake Off instead.
So is your love of horror films, is that from a young age? And is that something that's got you into doing this?
It's not. I was a late convert, a late adopter to horror films. I remember watching Scream as a student. And Scream's kind of quite postmodern. It's you know, quite you know, reflects on many films that have come before it. And I just watched it and I thought, this is brilliant. And then I went back and discovered lots of the films that had, you know, been referenced in it or inspired it. And I just think I very much embraced horror since then. I think I liked scary stuff. I mean, I've always been fascinated by ghosts, and I remember reading ghost stories in the school library from a really early age. But, you know, moving into horror, I mean, horror is something that you've got to hit at the right point in your life. I've spoken to some people recently, said I watched a certain horror movie too early on. I watched it with some older kids, you know, my older siblings or whatever, and it just did for me and traumatized me. So I think I found it at the right point. And I don't know, there's something deeply exhilarating about being scared.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, I have gone on to write horror, and, you know, I wrote a play, 222, a ghost story, which is horror. It's horror in the theatre. And I think that I would make the case that it is one of the most exhilarating mediums that, you know, sitting in a cinema, or even, I think even more so maybe in a theatre where you're, you know, there's real people on stage and you're, you know, very much aware of the people you're surrounded by. I just think it's so exciting, and that rush of adrenaline. And also, it's the fact that every sinew of us doesn't want to be scared. There's a bravado. You're going, I'm not going to be scared by this. And I think that's maybe one of the things that you get off on as a kid when you're watching horror. You're like, I'm not going to be scared. I'm tough. And then, whoa, God. Yeah. And so I love that. I think it unleashes something in all of us. It's kind of cathartic to be scared.
Do you scream when you're watching horror films?
I scream a lot. I have to watch horror films in short installments. Kind of, I pause it every so often. I have to manage my fear.
Oh,
you know.
that must be fun for the people you're watching it with.
Yeah.
I am a quite prolific coward. I'm really, really, really scared of things. I'm pathetic. I get very scared by flying on aeroplanes.
Same.
Same.
And I'm basically willing it to stay in the air. I'm terrified of heights, to the point where once or twice in recent years I've been up high somewhere and my legs have literally shook in a sort of pendulum motion, swinging
Oh, wow.
back and forth, where I feel like I'm effectively losing control of my body. I'm scared of many things.
Good industry to be in then.
Yeah, no. Well, you might ask, why am I provoking fear if I'm such a scaredy cat? And I guess, I don't know, maybe it's that. Maybe that's the reason. I mean, maybe I'm quite fascinated by fear. And I think I would make a case that ghost stories are about containable, controllable fear. You know, they're stories that we've told by the fireside for centuries now. And I think they are a bid to make sense of certain things. I think they're a bid to make sense of our fears, but certainly to make sense of our greatest fear, which is death. And I think I speak as somebody who's very, very frightened of death. And I think that for me, that's really the spine that runs for everything, my fear of death. And I think ghosts are an attempt to try and make sense of it and to possibly kind of provide some sort of comfort blanket or kind of safety net between us and death.
You've sort of addressed this in some ways on the pod, Uncanny, for listeners that haven't listened. My favourite podcast, personally, after Unquestionable.
No.
Uncanny.
Thank you.
I've been refreshing it for the last few days, like waiting for the next new episode.
It's been Christmas.
I did it in the car. I know. I was like, oh, it's still Christmas. Come on, it's the new year. So, I know you've addressed this, very vaguely, but Danny, do you believe in ghosts?
I always provide this slightly inadequate answer, which is that I'm a skeptic who wants to believe. I desperately want to believe. I feel like... So, I mean, I mentioned death before. This all goes back to death for me. And I had a moment in my early 20s where I was utterly convinced that I was dying. I was lying on the floor of the bathroom of my mum's house on a Christmas break back from university, and I was convinced I was having a heart attack. It was kind of early hours of the morning, and I was there, and I was totally sure I was dying, and I could see angels coming to get me.
Were you on drugs by any chance?
Well,
that sounds like an LSD trip to me.
No, I certainly wasn't on any hallucinatory drugs. I'd been out. I'd had a night out, and I think, it was a culmination of kind of me kind of partying too much and pushing my body too hard, I think. But I was totally sure I was dying anyway, and then it emerged it wasn't a heart attack, it was a panic attack. And it was something that many people listening will have had, and terrifying but not life-threatening. But for me, it kicked off certainly a year, if not more, of really, really intense fear of death, where every second of the day I was totally sure I was dying. I thought it was a brain tumour or a heart attack, every little twinge in my body. And I couldn't function at all. I couldn't sleep, socialise, kind of study, couldn't do anything really. It was just horrible and debilitating. And that fear of death still lingers in me. I still would say that I'm kind of frightened of death and think about death too much, and it sort of dominates my life to some extent. And I think for me, my interest in ghosts is very, very linked to that. And so I want to believe so much, because I see ghosts as the antidote to death. That if they exist, then death isn't the end. And I think I've always had a kind of an unhealthy relationship with death. I remember as a kid kind of wanting to be cryogenically preserved in a pyramid at the bottom of the garden. Eccentric desires for an 8-year-old boy.
You still could.
But so for me, it's about that. And I would make the case that that's maybe true of most of us, actually. And I think we might not admit that to ourselves or acknowledge it too much. But I think that death is more frightening than anything else I can think of. It's more frightening than ghosts or monsters or heights or planes or anything like that. And it's the phobia that all phobias lead back to, I think. I mean, I think, even if your phobia is... there are some very niche phobias, aren't there? Buttons. Some people are terrified of buttons, but I would argue that that's because somehow you think that button will kill you. I think we're driven by the fear that the thing we're frightened of will be the end of us. And so I desperately want to believe ghosts exist. And do I? I mean, I'm on this journey where I would say I'm kind of moving further from skepticism towards belief, but I would say I'm still very much stuck in the middle, torn like Natalie Imbruglia. And
you had to slip that in there, didn't you?
I don't know. I just don't know. I mean, I can't explain a lot of the things that I'm told.
I mean, we see this a lot in society. I mean, you could look at it from your perspective. You're afraid of you personally dying. Many other people have experienced some kind of loss in their lives, and so they're looking at death as sort of like, has this happened to my loved one? Like, what's happened to them? Are they still out there somewhere? And you see it in society and fluctuations of sort of like spiritual movements with, you know, post World War One, post World War Two, after various different pandemics. There's like spikes in spiritualism and seances and communicating with the dead and people seeing loved ones. Do you feel like there was a spike post 2020 pandemic where people looked for that, for meaning, because the world was spiraling out of control and it was some way of gaining control of the situation?
Yeah, well, certainly if you talk to people who take reports of paranormal activity, you know, kind of ghost hunting groups and parapsychologists and psychologists and various people, they will tell you that there was definitely a rise during the pandemic of reports of people feeling they were being haunted. And I think, you know, you could absolutely make the case that that's because we're cooped up in our houses and we have more time to imagine things. You could also make the case that we're cooped up in our houses and we have more time to be in contact with things. You know, that you know that there's a lot of time to be there and soaking up something that might be in your house. You know, and maybe in those moments where we are kind of more aware of our mortality, if you like, or more aware of, you know, our fears, maybe we are more receptive as well. So I think you can make both kind of team skeptic and team believer cases for that. But certainly it felt like there were more reports, and I think you can definitely draw analogies with post First World War and post Second World War. I think they are times when societies felt very chaotic and uncertain, and certainly we have that proximity to death. And I think I don't think that we have thought about death as much since the Second World War. I think the pandemic really made us face our mortality in a kind of quite unprecedented way in our lifetimes. And yeah, I just think that chaos and uncertainty breeds a desire for answers. And I think there's something about when our world feels broken, we go looking for another one. And I think the paranormal feels particularly attractive at moments of just sort of societal unrest. And, you know, I mean, you could go even further back. You could go back to Jacobean times and look at that era. I mean, I've got a personal interest in this because I've recently worked on something about the gunpowder plot. But that era of, you know, massive religious division, you know, people being killed for their beliefs, and plague, and, you know, witch hunts, all these kind of things. And the art of that time was it was horror, basically. You know, it was these plays that were full of blood and witches and demons and ghosts. And I think you could draw a line to now. I think really look out on any of the streamers and you'll see a lot of horror out there, you know, and that is kind of the horror of society being reflected back in the horror of the art. And I think the more extreme things get, the more we crave extreme art, I think, you know. So yeah, I know, but I think we as a society are looking for answers at the moment. And I feel I meet a lot of people who kind of say things to me like, I didn't realize how interested I was in ghosts. You know, it's not until I listened to your podcast that I realized how interested I was. And I think there's maybe a nostalgia being tapped into of some, you know, the 70s and 80s were full of programs and books about ghosts and UFOs and the supernatural and Bigfoot and Yetis and all these kind of mysteries. And I think there's a nostalgic desire in people of a certain age tapping into that again. But I also see, like, on TikTok and, you know, Reddit and all sorts of places which are kind of home to younger you know, consumers of the internet or whatever, you know, I think there's a massive interest in the paranormal there as well. I think it's really widespread.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, because it feels like, you know, even in the UK now, we've had a sort of decrease in religious belief and, you know, less people going to church and, like, in general. And I wondered if, like, the paranormal, supernaturals kind of filled that gap a little bit for some people.
It's a really interesting point. I think one of the reasons that the supernatural became so important to people after the First World War was that organised religion wasn't fulfilling the need. You know, organised religion couldn't process this mass outpouring of grief. It didn't know how to speak to these people. And I think, you know, mediums and spiritualism filled that gap, you know, and so I think, you know, yes, and, you know, we live in a sort of increasingly more and more secular, irreligious society. And I think that you could say we need belief. I think maybe we all need belief. I sort of feel like I've been searching for belief my whole life, craving it. I was brought up in a belief-free household. My mum was somebody who'd been brought up a Catholic and had gone through the kind of quite sort of punishing convent school education, nuns who measured the shortness of her skirt and would beat you for having a fringe, that kind of thing. And she'd made the decision at university to become an atheist and was bringing us up in a household that was quite anti-religion, I guess. She felt quite angry about the way she'd been brought up. But I would go to my grandparents and be fascinated by like the picture of Jesus looking down at me with his sacred heart, which felt like a scene from a horror movie, actually.
Yeah.
Bleeding heart.
Well, yeah. Well, the crucifixion is it's pretty
This
harsh.
somber, pale-faced, sad-looking man. And books about popes, books about nuns. We had a nun and a monk in the family, and so I was fascinated, and I knew that I was intrigued by the possibility that there was something more out there, and I wondered if there was a club out there that I wasn't a member of that kind of had some secrets that I would like to be privy to. I think
Spiritual FOMO.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah,
It really was. It really was. And I think, I've throughout my career I've explored things. I wrote something about monks at one point. I went to lots of monasteries. I've done stuff about evangelical Christianity. But I've found more and more that the belief that fascinates me is the belief in the supernatural, I think, But you could argue that religion and paranormal belief are really going in the same direction. They're both trying to make sense of what happens to us after we die.
Yeah, and giving us comfort as well. I mean, like they've done studies on when there is a crisis in the world, the people that have a faith, whether that be through religion or through some form of spirituality, or even like, Buddhism and stuff like that, they are able to sort of get through things a little bit easier, and their mental health is less affected and stuff like that.
Yeah, I think, it's very comforting to have certainty. I think, again, talking about fears that humans have, I think uncertainty is right up there as one of the most frightening things, And so to move into a stage of your life where you feel like there are answers, particularly for what happens to you when you die, is I imagine kind of very comforting and relaxing. I don't know, I think, I also see a lot of stigma towards people who believe in ghosts. And I think that my podcasts are, the aim of what I do is to change the narrative around the paranormal, really, and to introduce a kind of the art of listening, I guess. I think for too long we've been quite dismissive of people who claim to have paranormal experiences, and I think that's been a massive shift. I think if you look back into the past, there were kind of these classic ghost cases, like a kind of Borley Rectory or a Enfield haunting, where there was this huge public interest around it, and it became, the kind of front page newspaper news, a nation gripped by it. And actually now, somebody raises their head above the parapet to say they've seen a ghost, and they're instantly shot down. People go attention seeker, fraud, charlatan, or even worse, kind of questioning their mental health. And I think, I have had so many emails from people who've said that they've never told anybody about their experience, not even their partner. And so to create a kind of safe space, I always think of it as being a bit like the confessional box, that it's a safe space to talk about this thing without worrying that you sound mad. And I feel that's an achievement I feel quite proud of, actually, that I do feel the dial has shifted a bit now, and that it feels easier to talk about these things.
Well, it's a very curious but also compassionate podcast, which is why I think it's so nice to listen to as well. But it feels like, I mean, I might be wrong, but it feels like you've almost created a bit of a community, and there are people obviously that write in, and it's, you describe it as kind of like a group investigation. Everyone's a part of it by listening to these stories and stuff like that. Is that true?
Yes,
do you feel
it
like
is.
that?
And I think, I've there's so many little things that have happened to me throughout my life that have come together to form the approach that I take, I think. But one of them is certainly, I used to do stand-up comedy, and I became more and more aware of how stand-up could be quite cruel and could pick on people and victimize people. And I'd watch these stand-up comedians go out there and pick on individual people and go, all right, mate, what are you? Oh, look, he's a bit funny. And I thought, God, what if you just talk to the whole audience rather than pick on individual people? Get the whole audience on your side, and suddenly you're this big gang together. And so I did a few Edinburgh shows where I was totally focused on audience participation with everybody together. And I loved it. And I kind of got off on it. I just really enjoyed that thing of, being the conductor for a big group of people. And I think with the pods, I just really wanted to do that. I wanted to kind of do this interactive experience, talking to people, but just to build a group mentality, I guess. And I was also quite influenced by. There was a wake of lots of live television programs at a certain point. My wife worked on one of them. She was a production manager on Foxes Live. And it was a nature program about foxes, and they got lots of VT packages about foxes. But they stood outside Battersea Power Station. They kept going, "It's live, it's live, we're live." And then another VT. Here we go. We recorded this earlier, but we're live. And
there aren't any foxes here.
But no, exactly. We've got no foxes, but they're on telly. But it's live, and I loved the energy of it. And I just thought, God, how can you make a podcast feel live? So I guess Battersea Poltergeist, my first BBC podcast, and Uncanny, they've been this attempt to kind of talk to everyone out there and to make it feel live, make it feel exciting, make it feel like you're having this conversation in the moment. And I just love it. I'm sort of being a bit scattergun here, but another thing was I remember going to watch Robbie Williams singing, and he made everybody in that audience feel like he was singing directly to them. Anyone who's seen him will know what I mean. He's got this quite unique ability to make you feel he's singing to you.
Yeah.
And again, if you can make your podcast feel like it's talking to individual people and that it's a conversation, it's a powerful thing, I think. And I think any of us who make podcasts kind of are in a very privileged position if we get to build up a little audience that feels like a gang. But people sometimes say to me that I feel like their mate or their friend, and I think that's the greatest tribute you could have, really. And I think podcasts can feel like that. And during the pandemic particularly, you were asking me about ghosts on the increase in the podcast in the pandemic. I think podcasts increased in the pandemic, and people needed that. We wanted entertainment, but we wanted friends as well. The podcast could feel like your mate.
Yeah, that's partly why we started this one, isn't it? Because we wanted people to get to feel like they were having a conversation with cool people that we would want to talk to. So in interviewing you, our listeners feel like they're talking to you. That was kind of one of our aims, wasn't it? Yeah.
I mean, I've just been on tour around the country actually doing a live version of the podcast and literally talking to people and kind of, meeting up and doing meet and greets afterwards. And it's just brilliant. And I think maybe there was I think people have a desire to be part of a club, and the idea of joining together and, we give people tasks. We say, help us solve this mystery. Can we make sense of this haunting? And I just think that's quite empowering. I think for a long time, particularly on television, a lot of things spoke at you, and the idea of something where you are a participant and not a spectator, and where you get to join in, and where actually the thing only works if you do join in. I think is quite lovely, and that's I think what makes people want to share it as well. People kind of want to get their mates involved because then they can do it together. I've got a really clear memory of listening to the podcast Serial, the true crime podcast, and going and meeting up with some mates in the pub to discuss it. And I thought,
amazing.
If a podcast or a TV series can make you go and meet up with your mates and try and crack the mystery, then it's not
that's
bad.
awesome.
Going back to the podcast and the people that you have on, I mean, obviously, for these people, like you said, there's a skepticism. There's maybe they don't want to talk to people about it because they feel like they're going to be taken the piss out of or whatever. But you're giving them a chance to feel validated and a chance to actually speak their truths about these things. Can you talk on that a little bit?
Yeah, totally. And I think, that's a good way of putting it, their truths. I think, everybody who appears on my shows, I totally and utterly believe that they are telling me their truth and that they are totally convinced this thing happened. And I think from then we debate, whether the thing that they saw was actually a ghost. And indeed, what does a ghost mean? I mean, there's a great quote from Harry Price, the legendary ghost hunter, which I'll butcher now, but it's something like, if people say to me, do ghosts exist? I say, yes, they definitely do, because people are having these experiences and seeing these things. And certainly people are seeing something and hearing something. And, you could argue about the kind of, just the word ghost. Does that mean experiences produced by our minds, or does it mean the spirit of the dead, or does it mean some sort of paranormal energy force? There's so many different things a ghost could be. And the fun of the show is debating that, and if you are a skeptic, it's a how done it. If you're a believer, it's a who done it. But yeah, I mean, I think the validation is crucial. And I think, for a lot of people, you were talking about grief before as well. And I think, the most powerful stories are the ones that are about processing grief and dealing with loss. And those are the ones that you feel that you do not want to explain away, and I think that's where the experience has often provided some incredible kind of coping mechanism for the person. But but also, just, those are the stories that excite me the most in terms of coming closest to proof as well, I think. That idea of those moments where you feel like you really could be in contact with someone that you loved and lost, and I think it's so powerful. But yeah, I just think, there are lots of studies done of how many people believe in ghosts, and I think it normally comes out on average as being about a third of people believe in ghosts. Maybe sort of up to kind of 40% sometimes, but I just think that's wrong. I think there's so many more people out there who believe in ghosts, and so many more people who've had experiences, and they just don't talk about it. And you've got this amazing people under that tip of the iceberg that we hear about. You've got this amazing body of people who've been sitting there with experiences that are potentially as interesting and rich and deep as an Enfield haunting or a Borley rectory or any of these kind of big cases, just not talking about it because they fear that if they say it out loud, that their friends may no longer be their friends, or even their partner may not want to talk to them anymore.
That's crazy.
We had one story recently where the guy was like, "Yeah, I'll come and talk to you, but I don't really want my partner to know at the moment." And
Wow,
really? It's how. I wrote a play about this. My play 222 A Ghost Story is about a woman who believes her house is haunted and her husband who does not believe in ghosts and won't go on that journey with her and blocks her fear. And how do you resolve that? When the person who you love doesn't believe you.
Well, one of your recent episodes, that kind of did happen, right? There was a woman who's experienced with all this stuff and her husband refused to believe it until he experienced something as well. Actually, it's happened to me too.
Yeah. And I love those stories that unfold like that.
Yeah.
But I guess, for me, the perfect uncanny witness is somebody like Ken from the Room 611 story. I don't know how many people listening will be familiar with that story, but basically it was a hall of residence in Belfast, and students were having experiences in this bedroom, and then they discovered that students the year before and students the year after had these experiences. It was a case that kept unfolding and growing and growing. And but Ken, the guy who told it to me, was this eminent geneticist, this kind of incredibly sober scientist who didn't believe in ghosts, but just couldn't get over the fact that he felt he might have seen one. And I love that. And that's what sets my pulse racing. And I think for a long time, paranormal television particularly was kind of almost pantomimic entertainment where, you went to a haunted pub or a haunted castle and you kind of camped the night, and there were mediums who channeled the ghosts on demand just in time for the commercial break. And it was entertainment. But people like Ken wouldn't have talked to a show like that. They wouldn't have felt comfortable sharing their story in that context. And I think, like with Uncanny, we've created something that is entertaining and scary, but does seek to provide some answers, I think. And so I think there's a lot of people out there who have come forward because they felt okay talking about it now.
Yeah. I mean, I would argue just from listening myself that most of the people that you interview, you say to them, "Do you believe in ghosts?" They say no. "Do you think you've seen the ghost?" "I don't think so, but I don't know what I have seen." Can you explain? They're not looking to convince anyone like, "Oh, no, but it was a ghost. It was a ghost." Most of them, I think, are kind of like, "No, I don't even believe in ghosts, but I cannot explain this weird thing." It's really fascinating.
And I love the fact that skeptics and believers listen in equal amounts, and also that there's an even bigger group in the middle who don't know what they think. And I think, I sort of feel like, I mean, this might sound slightly kind of megalomaniacal or mad, but I sort of feel like, in a way, Uncanny is a kind of model of how I would like society to be. Like, I think it's okay to be unsure. It's okay.
Nuance.
Yeah, totally. I mean, we live in a world where we're almost forced into taking very binary polarized positions now. You hate or you love, you're yes or you're no, and you have to define yourself by what you're for and what you're against, and on social media you dig your trench and you stick to it and you don't change your mind whatever people say, and you just shout and shout and shout. And actually the idea that you can be uncertain and that you can change your mind, and maybe change your mind several times in an episode, I love and welcome, really. And I think I'm intrigued by that grey area between the black and white positions that we're forced to take.
Yeah. Oh God, if life was like that in general, just being open to being wrong, wouldn't that be nice?
And allowing people to make mistakes as well, I think, and allowing people to change their minds. I mean, there's a tendency in society now to, when somebody does something wrong, makes a mistake, says something wrong, that there's no ability to learn from it and change and move on. People are kind of punished for that. That's them. They've you know, they've dug their trench, you know, they dug their grave, and, you know, they're consigned to the pit of hell now, you know. I think, you know, a society that doesn't allow people to learn from mistakes and change, I think, is a society that's punitive and wrong, really, I think. So I think the ability to change your mind and to keep an open mind is incredibly important.
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. So are there things like that you see as common threads, or, you know, when you're dealing with stories, are there certain things that kind of reoccur for you when you're investigating something?
There are, definitely. I mean, I would say transitional periods and transitional spaces. And by that, I mean, I think there are periods in our lives where we are shifting from one sense of reality to another. And it could be growing up, it could be adolescence, it could be going to university. I get a lot of stories from students, or, you know, from when people were students. I think, you know, it could be losing a loved one and grieving. It could be a separation. It could be moving house. You know, I mean, so many stories start from somebody moving into a new house. But it's that moment of transitioning from somewhere where you feel comfortable and safe to somewhere that feels different and strange. And I think, again, you know, that could be that, you know, it puts you in a period of time of more anxiety and you're kind of more likely to imagine things, or it could be that you are open, you know, it opens you up. And certainly when I look back at, I found some letters I wrote as a student recently in my attic when I was tidying up, and it was like looking at a different person. I felt like I was this sponge soaking up the experiences of life and so open to everything. And I do wonder if there are periods in your life where you are more open and receptive to, you know, if there is something out there, you know, to whatever that is.
Interesting.
But also then, I mean, transitional spaces, doors and mirrors and stairs, you know, these things that take us from one to another, windows, you know, there's something, you know, many stories feature those. And again, you know, kind of believers and skeptics would have a field day about what those say to us. But I think there's definitely something that within our human brains about shifting, moving states, you know, that seems to kind of, you know, there's that quote, isn't there, about there are things known and there are things unknown in between other doors. You know, and I think, you know, there are many doors, both literal and metaphorical, in ghost stories.
Have you got any ghost stories of your own?
Well, no. I mean, I've kind of sailed through life
Wow.
without seeing ghosts, and I live vicariously through the stories that I am told. I mean, this is my tragedy in a way. I'm kind of tone deaf, you know. I'm literally tone deaf as well. I can't sing at all, but I keep wanting these experiences, and I've been to places. You know, I've been to like 30 East Drive, which is meant to be the most haunted house in the UK.
Oh,
it's
really?
where this famous case, the Black Monk of Pontefract, took place, and I found myself
see.
there just willing it, kind of going, come on, you know, let a plate fly through the room, or
Yeah,
somebody pull my hair, you know. But I haven't, you know. So I sort of, I don't know. I sort of feel this longing, and yet this kind of sense of be careful what you wish for. I think because I'm, you know, going back to that thing of being a coward. I'm not totally sure that I could cope with.
And would you believe it, or would you just think that's just a figment of my imagination?
There's a draft in here.
Yeah,
That's why
well,
that
that's
plate
just
fell off the wall.
grief. You know, if you see a loved one.
I don't know. I see. I mean, again, you know, I haven't been exposed to extreme grief, and I mean, you know, you hope to dear God that you can kind of sail through life avoiding that kind of thing. But certainly, that's something that often seems to push you into a moment of you know, potentially having experiences and potentially believing, more likely to believe. But no, I mean, I haven't, and I sort of do find myself kind of on this quest in search of it.
Yeah.
You know, and I wonder, I mean, I think if I did have an experience, if I did see something that I felt was categorically a ghost, it would totally shift the nature of what I do, I think, and it would shift my relationship with my audience, it would shift my relationship with my material, with the people who talk to me. And so
what
you know,
I would love to see is if you saw a ghost between like now and next season, and then you became this like craze, like they do exist, like forcing it down everyone's
I
throats.
drank the Kool-Aid at last.
Yeah. He's out on Trafalgar Square just with a megaphone, like, they're here,
The end
they're
is
among
nigh,
us,
the
they
end
walk
is
among
nigh.
us.
It is funny. I've talked to Kieran O'Keefe, our skeptic expert, about what would it take to make him believe, and he says, you know, he'd have to see the thing, have it videoed, have somebody else there independently verifying it, and
Be covered in ectoplasm.
yeah, exactly. And I think, you know, he's just very resistant to the idea of believing, and you know, believing it's truly a ghost. And I think, you know, so aware of the many ways that our minds can trick us that he doesn't trust his own mind.
So true, so true.
But I mean, without like the idea of the ghost, some of the stories, obviously, there's so many coincidences and scenarios that take place that are so unusual. I mean, you know, the world is full of coincidence, but sometimes it's hard not to believe that something strange and magical, otherworldly has happened.
Yeah, totally. And I have a funny relationship with the number 22. I wrote this play called 222, and Tom Felton, who some people will be familiar with as Draco Malfoy from Harry Potter, was in my play, and we struck up a friendship. And he said to me one day, he said, "Why did you call it 222?" And I was like, "Oh, I don't really think there was a reason. I mean, I just chose a random time. I mean, I suppose actually, well, 22 is my lucky number, and you know, I try and book row 22 on an aeroplane and things like that, and I do that because my birthday is 22nd of September." And he went, "Hold on a minute." He went, "Check my Wikipedia page." And I looked and he was like, his birthday is 22nd of September as well. And we were like, whoa, hang on a minute. And then since then, we've had this relationship of kind of constantly coming into proximity with 22, or 222. So I'll find myself sitting on...
This is episode 20. No,
yeah, exactly. I'll be sitting on seat 22 in a theatre without realising I'm booked into hotel room 222 or whatever. And we keep having this and sort of sending each other these pictures from around the world of 22. So I don't know, is that just my brain noticing that, or do I actually have some sort of strange relationship with that number? I think, you know, our brains notice coincidences. We don't notice all the moments when it doesn't happen.
Yeah.
You know, but having said that, I mean, I've been told some utterly mind-boggling coincidence stories. There was one that still sticks in my head. I did a series called Haunted, like a kind of prototype of Uncanny, a podcast series. And this friend of mine told me a story about his mother died, and the moment that he received the phone call telling him that his mother had died, 2 incredibly heavy metal shelves on opposite sides of his kitchen both fell off simultaneously. They'd been screwed on the wall for years. There was no reason why they should fall off, and they fell off simultaneously on opposite sides of the room. And you think, well, it must be a coincidence, mustn't it? And yet, how can it possibly be? It feels too perfect a coincidence. And I keep coming up against moments like that, I think. But yet, you know, coincidences do happen, and they can be bizarre, truly bizarre. There's you know, I think I'll not do this one justice, but Kieran told me about a story about a young man who had become so angry with his parents that he'd brought a gun to try and shoot them, but then couldn't bring himself to shoot them. And then decided to kill himself by throwing himself off a building instead. And he threw himself off the top of a building, and he would have been saved by landing on the canopy of the thing he was going to be saved. Story. And yet he was killed by a bullet fired by his father using the gun he'd bought trying to kill the mother, that came flying out the window and killed his son instead. I'm sure I haven't done that story justice. There'll be people who know the story.
So anyone seen the film Magnolia by Paul Thomas Anderson? There's a whole sequence at the beginning of coincidental stories, and that
right.
actually he films that. But it's
mean,
crazy.
Absolutely crazy.
Yeah.
There's a whole list of them. I mean, if you go digging on the internet, you'll find so many coincidence-based stories, and the thing is, they are incredible. They are mind-boggling, and we notice them, and they leap out at us because they are so strange.
Yeah.
Oh, that's creepy, that one. I've got a ghost story for you, Danny.
Oh, go on.
And it's for you specifically because it involves one of the places that you've had an episode about.
Oh my God.
Yeah, what a coincidence, right? Speaking of coincidences, because it was the episode that was set in Rottingdean.
Oh, yeah.
Do you remember that one?
Very well, yeah.
Well, it's funny.
Do you want me to remind people about
if you could, yeah.
So this was called The Return of Elizabeth Dacre, and was about a guy called Grant who bought a house in a place called Tudor Close in Rottingdean, which is this windswept, quite atmospheric village very close to Brighton on the south coast. And Tudor Close was the inspiration for the Cluedo board game. It was a hotel frequented by celebrities back in the 30s, and then it became, broken into houses, but it inspired Cluedo. And in this case, he kept seeing the ghost of Elizabeth Dacre, who was the woman who'd owned the house before him, and also, though, had a weird seeming time slip moment going into his kitchen where he saw a group of hotel diners from the 1930s. So, anyway,
a little bit like The Shining.
Yeah, it was very like The Shining, definitely.
And then
what have you experienced?
So, when I was listening to that episode, I think I was like painting, and And when you said Rottingdean, I was instantly like, oh, Rottingdean, because I used to live in the little village next to Rottingdean. So I used to go to Rottingdean all the time. I used to go to all the pubs and stuff. I was like, oh, I bet it's in one of the haunted pubs. You know, they're all old buildings and stuff. And then when you said Tudor Close, my heart dropped into my stomach because, so just for anyone that has obviously never been there, for most people, Tudor, the house itself is kind of like a horseshoe shape. And from how it was described, I'm guessing that Grant had the main bit, which is like the middle bit of that house, and then each side there was sort of like a side of the house coming off that. So a friend of mine, her parents had bought one of the side houses, so not the same house as Grant, but one of the ones off the edge of it. And she was like staying with her parents at the time, so I used to go around there sometimes and hang out. And I always had the worst feeling in that house. It was like a feeling of dread. And you walk in, when you get these feelings of like, oh, it feels creepy, you always sort of go through in your mind and think logically, oh, it's probably because it's an old house, you know, low ceilings, small windows, dingy, blah, blah, blah. But it was one of those houses where if you were in a room on your own, you would feel like someone was watching you and you'd like run out of the room to be with someone. Or if everyone was upstairs and you were downstairs on your own, you'd like run up the stairs and you feel like someone was chasing you. I had some really creepy rooms and it just felt like a horrible place to be. And I never said this to her because I didn't want to offend her. And shortly, they weren't there for that long. Shortly afterwards, they sold the house and moved away. And then we were talking. I was like, it's funny because I never liked that house. I always felt a bit creepy in it. And she was like, so many people have said that to me since we've sold it. She said the reason why my parents sold it is because they were convinced it was haunted.
Oh,
So they'd had all these experiences.
Well, I haven't got any
and
friends anymore.
the TV were turning on, it was like turning on its own, like all the classic haunted house stuff. I was like, oh my God, I've been in one of the houses that you did a thing on. It's so weird. And then there was another episode set in Farnham and I've been in the place that she was talking about.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah,
Oh,
so
wow.
I was like, wow, I'm just doing a tour.
I was
of
going
all
to
the
say,
different
yeah,
places.
you've been around.
I would
Been around the
love to hear
houses.
from more people who lived in Tudor Close and know if it was widespread.
Yeah, or like the other sides of the house as well.
It's funny, I went down there myself. I didn't go there. When we were making the episode, I didn't go there. I interviewed Grant elsewhere. But I then went, I was in Brighton. I said to my wife, let's just go and have a look. Let's go and check out Tudor Close. And we went there on this little kind of pilgrimage to look at it. And it's right next to a graveyard. And we sort of stood in the graveyard looking over the wall. And I just heard, Danny! Danny! Looked across and there was this family of Uncanny fans who'd come down to do exactly the same thing. And I, hello, what are you doing here?
Yeah, we're doing the same thing. Yeah. You're here to see the house.
Exactly.
Yeah.
People just think you are hanging out at all these places.
I'm just there all the time in the graveyard.
Oh, amazing. Have you done that with many of the haunted houses? Have you gone to see any
going
of them?
on well, no, but I've got a long-standing deal to go to Louisbelt, which anyone who knows the podcast will know it's a remote Scottish bothy in the middle of nowhere in the Highlands. I don't think you can't drive there. You can drive to a certain point and then you have to walk 13 miles to get to this remote bothy, this remote ruined cottage. And so I said I would go there with the guy it happened to, and we would kind of go and spend a night there. So I've got to fulfill that. That's important.
That's awesome. Yeah, I was going to say you could do like a group pilgrimage there.
I know. I mean, uncanny ghost tours. For sure.
Yeah.
I'm worried I might become the sort of the thing I have rebelled against. You
give up broadcasting. Just do ghost tours. Oh man, that's so cool.
I was going to ask, like, obviously we've talked about this a little bit, but it feels like for all the kind of, you know, the skepticism and everything, for a lot of people, it actually brings them quite a lot of comfort. You know, the comfort of like knowing that there may be something beyond what we are in our, you know, in the real world. So do you feel like also for the people that come on and talk to you that you're an outlet for them, but that gives them some sort of not closure necessarily, but some comfort to go on, you know, with the rest of their life?
Definitely. I think for the people who talk to me, I think it's a huge comfort. And I think it's often a massive catharsis, you know, and I think. You know, I know that, you know, I mean, I think particularly when we went onto television and we did a TV series and it felt like that was much more public. I think there was a nervousness in the people who came to talk to me about, you know, will I be pilloried? Will I be vilified? And, you know, I said to them, like, you know, if you look at all of the people who come before us, everyone is glad they did it and feels a relief and has been so supported. That's the thing, the Uncanny community, as people have called themselves, has been so supportive, so warm, and that's many skeptics within that as well. It's not just people who believe. Everybody is kind of, whatever they think about whether it's a ghost or not, they're very gentle and very respectful to people, and that really, beautifully, that kind of continued on television, and those people had a really good experience of it as well. But so I think it's definitely cathartic. But I think, in terms of bringing comfort, I think I would argue ghost stories bring comfort to all of us. And I think I'm going to make a very, very bold statement that people can feel free to shoot down, which is that even if you don't believe ghosts exist, you secretly wish they did, or you secretly hope they did. And I think there's a little bit of us buried somewhere that would love this to be real, love this to be true. And I think it's why, as a society, that we still talk about ghosts. And this is the thing, because, we don't sit in pubs or on podcasts and debate if unicorns are real, or if elves still exist, or if dragons lurking in a cave, in the local forest, But we absolutely do talk about ghosts, and even if you're the most hardened skeptic, you will engage in a conversation about whether or not they exist, And I think that is testament to the fact that we as a society need ghost stories. It fulfills some deep need within us, and I think we go back to death. We go back to that fact that just processing death, trying to make sense of death. I think we need ghosts, and if you can absolutely think that ghosts are this kind of this smokescreen, this kind of fiction that we've invented to protect us from the kind of harsh horror of the fact that we just cease to be, or you can think that we're still talking about ghosts because that is what happens. That ghosts do come back, and it's proof of life after death. But I think we need them, and I think when you listen to my podcast, even if you're a skeptic, I think it brings some kind of comfort. It brings the comfort that any great mystery or thriller brings. As humans, we love to solve puzzles.
Yeah.
We just, I'm somebody who grew up loving detective stories, but I think, most great drama, most great fiction, a lot of great non-fiction as well is about making sense of things, trying to solve mysteries.
Yeah, so true. And we're sort of storytelling creatures as well, aren't we? I was just thinking, actually, we've never had a ghost-specific episode of Unquestionable, but we have spoken about ghosts quite a few times. Like, we spoke about them with Robin Ince, spoke about them with David Baddiel. There's probably been other people that we've had conversations with about ghosts when we're just talking about some other stuff. It gets brought up quite a lot.
David Baddiel came on Uncanny and did an episode of it, and it was interesting because he was certainly somebody who was very, very skeptic, and yet loved a good ghost story. I think I think for some people it's maybe their guilty pleasure.
Yeah, of course. I mean, it gives us hope, really, as well, doesn't it?
But really, I think that I don't know. I just don't know how you couldn't be fascinated by the problems that these things pose. The conundrums that these stories pose. I think that most paranormal broadcasting has been about places, and it's about going and camping out in a haunted pub or a haunted castle and spending the night. And I always found that quite anticlimactic. You're kind of forced to manufacture scares or excitement because 9 times out of 10 nothing happens. But what I do is about people, and I've always been fascinated by people, both in terms of making documentaries and as a drama writer, just kind of trying to understand people. And so all of the stories in Uncanny are about somebody having this life-changing moment, this moment where they think they witnessed the impossible and where their sense of their reality changed. And often that was accompanied by an extreme fear unlike anything else that kind of transformed their life, and a fear that was so powerful that they can't forget it, and they can remember it in crystal clear kind of precision. But often it's also accompanied by a kind of euphoria of kind of feeling they kind of glimpse this other world, So I think just as a student of the human condition, I think that's fascinating. And if you want to make sense of it through the paranormal, then absolutely great. And if you want to make sense of it through psychology and environmental factors and kind of all of the many things that we as human beings bring to the table, the kind of myriad stories that sort of swirl in our heads that we bring, the kind of cultural baggage we bring, then that's equally fascinating.